History.
We shall never surrender.
Politics.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony.
Current affairs.
Going to Pizza Express in Woking is an unusual thing for me to do.
Conspiracies.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
We'll stop terrorists from coming after us.
I just received a beautiful letter from Kim Jong-un.
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons.
I'm not guilty of harassing anyone.
Well, I'm not a crook.
This is the Political Dark Side Podcast. And now, here's your host, Matthew Howland.
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
Welcome to episode 19 of the Political Dark Side podcast. This isn't going to be your ordinary episode where we discuss superficial politics with the inevitable descent into bemoaning the World Economic Forum, because today's guest is David Rossi, aka Dave Zed of the Generation Z podcast. He is the founder of SALT LLC and hopes to bring forward information and solutions on suppressed sciences, such as zero-point energy, propulsion, and consciousness. You might have seen his show on YouTube already or heard him appear on other shows like the Higher Side Chats and a bunch of other popular alternative shows. So I'm privileged to have him join this small one-man band based here in Scotland. The working title for this episode is Reality, Simulations and Aliens. So yeah, something a little different. I always struggle to keep up with the concepts Dave presents because they're remarkably advanced, and he's very well spoken, as you'll see. And ultimately, also, I'm a midwit, so that doesn't help. But anyway, Dave, how are you?
I'm doing great, Matthew. First and foremost, let me just say that it is a pleasure and it's an honor to be here. I thank you so very much for the very generous introduction. I'm just someone who started reading like crazy at about this time last year and a half ago. So I appreciate the complimentary introduction. So I'm doing fantastic.
Good, you're very welcome. So I think the information that you put out is very interesting, and I want to try and introduce it to another audience in another country. Sure. Can you tell people a little about your credentials and how you got interested in the things that you were researching?
Sure, absolutely. So if you want me to start at the very beginning, what initially happened was I had started the podcast, the Generation Z podcast, right about the time that the pandemic had started. I was working in construction for family, and essentially, like most in the world, I had about a month or two off to basically do nothing, right? Where everyone sort of stayed inside and did their own thing. And essentially, I said to myself, well, I'm going to basically emulate Joe Rogan in the sense of just trying to discuss everything and anything. And if I got maybe, I was talking into a black screen, I was uploading just to YouTube. If I got maybe 10 views or listens, 7 or 8 out of the 10 being my mother, I would be happy. And then one day I did an episode on my take on the education system, things like this. And then eventually I did one episode on Project Blue Beam, this alleged staged or faked extraterrestrial invasion or something of the sort. And then it got almost like 5,000 views, something like 4,500. And I was like, wow, okay. And then I did another one on Operation Paperclip. It got like 1,500 views. And this was when I had no social media or anything like this. And so I said, okay, there's something there. But then I said to myself, if I'm going to dive into the, high strangeness, paranormal, UFO, UAP element of things, what can I do that's a little bit different than others? Now, granted, since then, there have been a lot of channels that have grown and have done quite well, and rightfully so. And justifiably so, with the aspect of exploring ideas, not saying one is right or wrong whatsoever. So if I may preface this as well before I go on to you and your audience, I'm not asking anyone to believe what I'm saying. I'm simply asking people to be open to some of the things that are being said here. And I encourage people to do their own research and you name it. But what then happened was essentially I started using the show as both a teaching and learning mechanism, if you will. And I barely passed high school, to be honest with you. I've failed math almost every year of high school and all that kind of stuff. And then what happened was about this time last year, maybe a little bit more than that, give or take, I said to myself, why not try and just simply build, quote unquote, this anti-gravitic, some form of it myself? Because why the heck not? I keep coming across this research for decades that people have said, it's a lot easier than people think. It's, it's under our noses. It's hidden in plain sight, as people say, or what have you. So and yes, I will say that, albeit it was a little bit expensive relative to, I guess you could say, not everyone has, for example, a couple $1,000s lying around. So it took me some time to, save that up and all of that. And between just some basic things out of the kitchen and some things at the hardware store and a couple orderings of some particular pieces of equipment, I was able to generate some type of what people would call, I don't necessarily like to call it this, and I'll get into that shortly later, but anti-gravitic effect or phenomenon. And then I was able to do it in different ways with different, with old microwaves. I was able to do it with different forms of liquid, then just purely with essentially electricity and magnetism, the electromagnetic angle, which a lot of people know to be the electrogravitic angle. And so I said to myself, okay, maybe this is a fluke. This is not a closed laboratory setting or experiment, whatever. But then all of a sudden, the place where I was experimenting, about 60 minutes down the road, there was a military base. And in which actually some months prior, I had gone for the show to try and interview some people if they had seen UAP or something like this. And I just got a complete, an utter response, no response, like a null response, basically, to anyone willing to speak or anything of the sort. And so what happened was, after I had turned on this, I call it, the quote unquote, the generator, after I had turned it on, jets started flying over the property in which I was located at and things like this. And I said to myself, okay. And then I wake up the following day, and then I start getting, over the coming days, following that particular day as well, I started getting emails from people, very high-level academics within the Department of Defense, things like this. And I'm like, whoa, okay. So clearly there's a there. And at the time, I did not understand it. And so what I then started doing was experimenting a little more. But then I said to myself, basically my gut told me, you should stop with the experimenting and focus more on understanding things first on the theoretical side, so then you can then apply it in an engineering sense. So I said to myself, I'm like, okay, that's what I'll do. So I spent months and months and months of rigorous, I guess you could say, self-teaching, self-learning, listening to different podcasts and shows. And graciously enough, after some time, some of these academics warmed up to some of my inquiries about this type of science and technology. And so essentially, fast forward to today, what ended up happening was, basically, I did not want to go under, I guess you could say, NDA, under any particular department, company, you name it. But because I do believe that a fair percentage of this knowledge, at the very least, could in fact come out in a safe regard. Now, I say that carefully, but what I'm getting at here is I started my own company called SALT, which stands for Strategic Analysis and Assessment of Longitudinal Technologies. Now, the reason I say that is because I basically wanted to NDA myself, not because I wanted to, but because I wanted to be able to speak about this publicly while trying to effectuate a benevolent change within, I know this is a bold statement, but within the military-industrial complex, because of certain, I guess you could say, outcomes and events behind the scenes that would warrant such possibility. And then essentially, I also didn't want to get disappeared. There have been some people that in fact did, you could say, crack this stuff, and would unfortunately either never heard from them again, or very sadly have been deceased. And so I wanted to ensure that that didn't happen to me, because I figured, okay, and I'm not anyone that, for example, I did not crack anything new per se. It was more so the unification of the way in which it was done amongst a plethora of avenues that I took. And so I'm not claiming to yourself, brother, or to your audience that I cracked the way or the set of ways. I cracked a set of ways, just to be clear. I'm not claiming whatsoever that my way or my set of ways of discovery is the end-all be-all. But I clearly garnered the attention of some prominent academics and military intelligence individuals within the Department of Defense, some currently still in there, some retired, some otherwise. And essentially, since then, I was able to navigate and work my way into making presentations, consultation reports, white paper reports to various world governments, various branches of world governments and private groups and interests, et cetera, et cetera. Believe it or not, even private individuals that believe in this kind of stuff, that are fairly prominent in the entertainment world, but they are too hesitant to come out and say publicly, well, we believe we were abducted at this point in time, and we had spent over $500,000 of our own money investigating this. But they approached me and said, Dave, we heard about the company through word of mouth and things like this, and we believe in what you're doing, and we'd like to know your take on what happened to us and things like this. And so, I would fly out, and as of what I'm also, as we had said before, started recording, the part of what I'm actually doing right now in the south of the United States, consultation work and trying to get, on the ground, understand the underlying, I guess you could say, energies and phenomenon that would cause this stuff. Now, what's interesting is that once one cracks, if you will, what's called anti-gravity, I prefer to call it gravity shielding, gravity negating, but whatever, not to be a smartass, but once one cracks that, the unfortunate, I guess you could say, unfortunate/fortunate feature to that is by small perturbations and adjustments to the generator, whether in a nuts and bolts sense or in a more energetically organic sense. I say organic relative to the natural electromagnetic resonance frequencies of the earth. One can turn that into a now I do have to be a little careful here, but one can turn that into a very beautiful, perhaps medically insightful and healing device. One could also turn it into a unfortunately a particle beam weapon amongst the avenue of many other things. So that's why I essentially started SALT, because I do understand, I don't necessarily agree, but I do understand why a lot of this has to be kept under wraps. But at the same time, I do believe that if done correctly, there are avenues that could be taken to take some of this, if not a good chunk of it, public. I wish it was as simple as, okay, you crack anti-gravity, that's it. You want to crack anything else from there, you got to work in other avenues or ways. But unfortunately, small adjustments to a generator, or to I call it the generator that I developed. I've developed, I think, almost 3 at this point, 3 variations. Any adjustment then turns it into, dare I say, which can be substantiated scientifically to a large extent in the public literature of academia, but it largely is now on restricted servers of DoD and all that. But it enables things like telekinesis. It enables things, for example, like I know this is a bold statement, but portals and stargates, things like this. And so I would dare to say, very humbly, before I finish up this little ramble here, that the same underlying energy, if you will, that many of our ancestors spoke of, whether people nowadays call it, Mr. Jack Sarfati calls it EVO, exotic vacuum objects. Dr. Pudov and co call it the 0 point energy. Dr. Salvatore Paez, the UFO Navy patent gentleman, calls it the super force. I think ultimately what we're looking at here is the same underlying energy, and this is no disrespect to any of my religious friends, but it could also be what Jesus called the Holy Spirit. I say this because this is the type of energy that is not just propulsion oriented. Once, and I don't mean this negatively nor positively, to be fair, once that energy is understood at how it could be extracted from the vacuum, as it's called, sort of like reaching into a bag and then pulling out what you want, it could be used for beautiful things, but it could also be used for very unfortunate things as well. So I'm trying my best to simultaneously bring this forward from the classified or sensitive realm to some degree into the public domain, while attempting as well to, I guess you could say, ensure that nothing slips up, in the sense that one adjustment to the generator of mine, for example, and you have a rail gun or a coil gun, right? So it becomes very touchy, if you will. And so I then learned, once understanding the science, that world governments, including perhaps even private institutions, maybe connected to world governments, do in fact have detectors in which can detect all of this. And so that was what essentially, as I understand it, put me on the radar initially, unknowingly. But it is what it is, and I'm not necessarily disappointed with how things panned out, given the fact that I'm still alive, I'm still here, and I'm still in communication with people, not just in the United States government, not just Canadian government, but as well as other world governments as well. It's a tough line to walk, but I'm trying my best to be able to bring as much as I can of it out without ruffling too many feathers of various industries and what have you, right? There's a big argument these days, for example, that this could in fact be a fourth turning or a new paradigm shift into an emerging industry. I would very strongly agree. It's just a matter of how a lot of people are trying to understand how the business model would be implemented, or if this is such accessible energy, how could it be controlled, if you will? Now, I'm not saying I agree with the concept of control, but at the same time, unfortunately, if a terrorist were to get their hands on something, even something that I developed for just a couple $1,000s, it becomes quite dangerous. It puts guns out of business. You're now talking the amplification of what we would call force fields. These are all, by the way, academically and scientifically substantiated to an extent in the public literature, going all the way back to the 1800s, even up to today. But it is most definitely, at least as I've experimented in actual laboratories and and have, of course, witnessed and seen and have consulted on in other regards as well with salt, it is very feasible. And so this is, you'll have probably a million and one reasons coming from particle physicists and electrical engineers as to why this is not the case. But I would say very humbly, one needs to have a not so much a granular and specific understanding of one particular field of the sciences, but rather an overall understanding of just all of it in general. And what I mean by that is optics, chemistry, physics, engineering, just a general understanding of a little bit each of the field, and then attaining what some would call a new perspective on old physics. It's not anything outside of our laws of physics. It does not break any of it. As a matter of fact, it stays within it quite comfortably, and it can be accounted for and calculated for, and whether theoretically or in an application-based sense. But that's essentially how I got to where I am now, and I appreciate the question, and sorry for the long ramble, but yeah.
No, it was an absolutely perfect answer. It sounds like you're very much trying to tread a fine line between a variety of interests, not least your own desire to stay alive more than anything.
Yeah. Yep.
Is there specifically people feeding you information which you are then told that you may or may not pass on to the general public?
That's an interesting question, and I don't mean to dodge around that. When here's what's interesting about all of that. When you say feed, you mean like someone hands me a document of scientific knowledge and they say, like, here, you can talk about this? Or, I mean, I'll tell you right now that okay, now this is the part where, with the utmost humility and respect to yourself and your audience, brother, I don't mean to sound conceited whatsoever, but because others have in fact cracked this as well, but if one is intelligent enough to crack this stuff, which it's not just me, I have faith in many people that can and probably will soon enough. But when one is smart enough to crack this stuff, one is smart enough to realize that when looking at even the public academic literature, this stuff is so well hidden that it's hidden in plain sight. So the reason I say this is that you kind of already know what line you can and can't cross without having to be told. There's certain terminology, certain things in the equations that I know that if I were to blurt it out right now, then I'm just increasing my risk of disappearing. Now, has anyone come to me directly and said, here's the line per se? No, not in that regard. Now, with that said, though, I've sort of given myself a line, and I've spoken to many, whether within DARPA, whether within people out of certain parts of DOD, other departments, and what have you, that have sort of given me a wink, nudge, nudge, as if to say, okay, if you want, you could push this one a little bit more, if you will. Compared to, say, 2 years ago, one would not be able to speak as avidly on a certain aspect of the sciences in that realm, if that makes sense. But have I been told directly, no, don't do this, or yes, do that, or yada yada? No.
That's fair enough. I mean, I think the last couple of years certainly has put a lot of people into questioning the nature of the science, for lack of a better word, but that's obviously a different avenue entirely. But it makes people more skeptical of what they're already been told, which can only be a good thing, presumably. And like you say, it probably puts people more towards cracking the physics of everything that you've described, and as you pointed out, it is mostly hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
So I recently heard you talking about the idea of reality and simulations and whatnot, and the idea that what we are experiencing has a holographic overlay. Can you explain that a little bit and how that relates to the stuff that you've looked into,
Sure.
and how it comes out with learning about the gravity systems that you've discovered?
Sure, absolutely. And man, great questions, by the way. I appreciate it. So imagine, for example, you're living in a very cold part of you're in the UK, I take it.
Yeah, Scotland.
Okay. Scotland. Okay. So imagine you're. Forgive me, I don't know what the weather's like specifically there, but imagine it's a very cold.
Freezing. It's
Okay.
freezing.
There we go. So as a Canadian, I can say that I understand. I feel your pain. So imagine you're in your bedroom, or say you're in an apartment in Scotland, and it's a freezing cold night, unfortunately, and you have the window open a little bit. I'm trying to use as practical an example I can. And say, for example, you have one layer or bed sheet atop on you. Will you feel the cold far more if you had just one blanket or multiple layers of blankets? You'll feel it far more if you had just one blanket on you, right? Now, imagine another 3 blankets over top that initial blanket of yours. That is what I would dare to say we can describe or allude to as an example, metaphorically, of a holographic substrate. What one is doing when they're accessing anti-gravitic energy or zero-point energy, or whatever one wants to call it, is essentially you are going from the very top of that blanket. To say there's 4 layers of blankets. You're going from layer 4 at the very top to then reaching down to layer 1. And then pulling layer 1 up to layer 4, but only in that particular spot that you've extracted it from, if you will, like taking a pencil and poking it down and then bringing it back up. That's essentially what you're doing in that particular way, if that makes sense, in a substrate sense, if you will, an underlying energy that comprises sort of like the code to a Call of Duty video game or to Grand Theft Auto. It's the same idea. Imagine you're playing Grand Theft Auto online, and instead of jumping in a car, you're walking into code. And then once you walk, it's sort of like in the Matrix film, with Keanu Reeves. You walk in, say that car, which normally looks like a car, is shaped like a car, but it's consisting of ones and zeros, binary numbers, let's say. And then once you approach that ones and zeros that comprises that car, you can then move that all those one and zeros around to turn the car into a helicopter, let's say. And now people that are viewing it from a distance are going to think, my gosh, that's magic. Perhaps even what our ancestors would call the same thing, which alludes to this idea, and it implies that we may be a species rediscovering the same scientific and alchemical principles over and over again. That is what I would liken it to be, in other words, when I talk about that whole concept of a hologram, if you will, that there's an underlying energy underneath, for example, our reality, in which what we would call, for example, even, Bigfoot, ghosts, poltergeist activity that has a direct interconnection with. So it's not just to me as well that, the UFO UAP phenomenon is something that is just that. And then, the paranormal stuff is separate. I would dare to say it is the same underlying energy that one is tapping for anti-gravitic propulsion. That is the same energy that is being tapped for, even dare I say, seances, in rituals. Whether for better or worse is not for me to say. Of course, it depends on the intent of that ritual and, what one is summoning and yada, yada. But it's the same, in my opinion, it's the same underlying energy one is tapping. Hopefully that's a decent enough answer.
Yeah, I mean, do you think this is necessarily what we experience is a question of perception, or that it could be a full-on simulation?
Both, in my opinion. I'd say both. You're a combination of both. An overlay in addition to some, in fact, legitimate. Well, then this gets into I don't mean to nitpick here, but when I say real or legitimate, I mean, I would be contradicting myself if I didn't say, okay, ontologically and philosophically, what is real? But ultimately, if we're going to stick to some sort of focal point of grounded framework, just for the sake of this conversation, yeah, I would say it's a combination of the two. It's sort of like, for example, when you see when you're going for a walk, say with the girlfriend, for example, and you're going for a walk up down the street or at the park or something, and you see a plane in the sky. When you look at the plane from a very far distance away, that plane is flat relative to your personal observation of the plane. Now imagine, for example, let's just, for the sake of this example, a major mountain or ramp appeared for you to approach the plane. And you could walk up to the plane and start to, sort of like in Fortnite, how you build those bridges. As you approach the plane, it becomes more 3D and interactable to you specifically. Say your girlfriend stayed back and didn't go on that bridge with you to walk up. She is going to still see the flatness of the plane, of that airplane. But you are going to be able to interact with it more because you specifically are getting closer to it. So in other words, this goes back to your question about perception and this whole concept of perhaps a simulation or metaverse or something like this. Dare I say that the same way that you are in your living room right now, your living room is not flat. It's interactable, right? Locally to you, you can get up, you can pick up that, a really cool set of pictures off the wall, take it down, all of that. But if you were to leave your room, you specifically, or leave that living room, you cannot do that. You specifically have to go back into the living room to do it. Now, people might say, well, Dave, that's nonsense, because when I FaceTime my friend or I Skype my friend, for example, I see them on the other end of the world. And well, okay, then how is that the case? Well, you are looking at them through a digitized transmission, a flat screen you are observing them through. You specifically are not there to experience such. You catch my drift? And this goes back to the whole concept of perception and simulation and holography and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, like I said to you at the beginning, I sometimes struggle to keep up with all the concepts all at once because it just builds on top of one another. But like in very like simplistic terms, like I've often thought, like how do I necessarily know that the things I see and experience are the same as what the person next to me sees and experiences? Like how do I know that what I look like in the mirror is what they see me as? And you just have these kind of mad thoughts because obviously it's all just electrical signals processed by the brain and presented as output.
Right.
It gets very messy, doesn't it? So
absolutely. Because I mean, for example, and I'll give you a perfect example. Imagine you and I meet up and we go for a pint or something like that, and we're leaving the bar and we look up and I go, Matthew, look, there's something in the sky. It's moving erratically, not sure what it is, and we're seeing this. Say it's a UAP, a craft, a UAP in one particular spot, but you're seeing a cube. I'm seeing a triangle. Say, for example, your girlfriend sees, not sure if you have one or not, but say she sees a circle, a sphere. None of us are right nor wrong. It depends on what the individual observed, which goes back to the dual slit experiment, which, has laid the foundation for quantum field theory, which is, again, the reality is only as real as the individual observing it. So again, who is right or wrong? And I don't mean to use this as a cop-out answer. The science substantiates this via what people could look up as Schwinger limits. What would also be that's quantum loop gravity, would also be Schrodinger's wave equation or Schrodinger's cat. Is the cat alive or dead? Both, but neither. It depends where you are looking at it from. Right? So we can go into all of that, and it speaks to this idea again of personal perception and experience. Sort of like running on a racetrack. We all have different ways of getting to the finish line, but we get to the finish line nonetheless. So from a philosophical and ontological standpoint, to me, that speaks to the idea of the joy is in the journey. So if you saw a square craft, a cube, I saw a triangle or a pyramid craft in the same spot that we all claim we each saw respectively different shapes. And, your girlfriend or the missus saw a sphere. Perhaps these are information structures that are relaying themselves to us in the way that we individually would be most comfortable in our perception of those information structures in our brain, neurologically. And such electric and magnetic impulses are sending those information structures via various nodes of the nervous system for us to interpret differently for various purposes relative to us individually, if that makes sense. So this is when it starts to get, dare I say, quote unquote, trippy. So people start saying, okay, well then, if that's the case, what's the difference between that and imagination? I would say not much. I would dare to say that actually what has been stigmatized is, oh, that's just imagination, forget about it. It's not just imagination, it's far more than that. For example, we see in, remote viewing sessions, people have said, well, they've been given coordinates, they've closed their eyes, they've got in these positions to see if they could view what's actually happening in real time at the coordinates they were given on another location on Earth. And these certain remote viewers would say, nothing's coming to me, man, nothing's coming. And then people, the head of the program would say, well, just use your imagination. What do you see? They'd be like, well, I see a bridge, I see this, I see that. They check up the coordinates in real time, and there's a bridge. So is that really imagination, or is that right? So it then begs the question as to, is there something missing in the academic literature? Is there something missing, for example, in various areas of, dare I say, even all of life, that is perhaps, I don't mean to sound overly conspiratorial, but has been deliberately butchered by nefarious forces with the intent to keep it suppressed? So, and all of this ties back to that underlying energy of tapping what people would call anti-gravity, if you will, in my opinion.
Yeah, it is certainly interesting when you consider imagination and dreams. I've got 2 dogs, and I often wonder, like, I can see them dreaming and running in their sleep, and obviously they're supposedly less intelligent than human beings. So when they wake up, I often wonder, do they necessarily realize that what they've just experienced is a dream, and that they're coming back into supposed reality, or that they actually feel like they've experienced what they've just had in their dream, and then they have to process that in conjunction with this reality, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Actually, as a matter of fact, you made me think of an example that I was not going to give just because I had forgotten about it for a few days, but now that you brought it up in that way, I now remember. Thank you. So imagine you go to the movie theater and you see, we understand that in a movie theater, a projector, a nuts and bolts device, is broadcasting light to a screen for our entertainment, right? Imagine our reality is the opposite. This light is broadcasting over what we call time and distance, a set of particle fluctuations that create nuts and bolts. You see what I'm saying? If we flip that around, if you will, imagine that as our reality. And so by tapping this anti-gravitic energy, this 0 point energy perhaps, you are then going back to maybe not necessarily the source of that light, but a closer step to it, if you will. And so that kind of takes me to the point of, well, people say, okay, this is when we start getting into, like woo-woo land, Dave, and, spirits and telekinesis and yada, yada. Well, I say to that very humbly and respectfully, I'm not asking people to go and start self-educating themselves to then run equations on, Ricci tensors and Riemannian manifolds and all this kind of stuff. So what I would say very simply is, well, we know carbon dioxide in one's garage when the car is still running in the garage. We know these things occur and are produced, but we can't see it or touch it. We probably could see it in a gaseous form, but we can't necessarily interact with it the way that, I can interact with my glasses as a physical object, for example, right? But the same way that, for example, we take a laser beam and we shoot it at our hand. We know we're shooting it at our hand. We can't feel it, but we know the beam is being shot, right? I would say the same thing to that of people who immediately dismiss or laugh at, for example, the concept of the soul, whether it's or even ghosts or paranormal entities or something like this. If one really looks into the scientific literature, one will find that this can in fact be accounted for without breaking any laws of physics. And so that's when, unfortunately, I do have to sort of draw a line in that regard. But the point is that ultimately it's ironic that people will, blindly believe that, the football game happening on TV is definitely happening in whichever state it's going on in, or whichever region of the country it's going on in. But for example, they'll believe, oh, honey, there's carbon monoxide in the garage. We got to, open the garage door a bit, shut the car off, whatever. But the second you say, well, I saw a deceased relative that was, that looked to be like a plasma being, or looks similar to carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide in the way that it appeared, people laugh right away and say, oh man, you need a mental hospital or whatever. That's, in my humble perspective, that's cognitive dissonance. That it doesn't, because that it can be calculated for, it can be accounted for. So that's where I go with that.
I think it's certainly a healthier perspective to be curious about everything in that regard, instead of just writing everything off. Like when most people like, if they ask me a question about this sort of thing, my go-to answer is I don't know. You know, certainly things like, you know, like flat Earth. It's like, well, I've not been into space. I don't know. I can only go by what I'm told and whatnot. Not to go down the flat Earth route, but you know, just as a basic example of.
Actually, can I, if I could say, Matthew, before you ask your next question, what I would like to say is that the more I learn, the more questions I have, because it speaks to this idea of, again, if you crack one thing, okay, well, what's that thing made out of? And then once you learn that, what is that thing made out of? And this speaks to the idea of fractals. But this also, in my opinion, speaks to the idea of, dare I say, even the purpose of life, perhaps. The joy is in the journey. Life is movement. So it speaks even to what computer scientists are saying when they say that the transition state from one energy node to another is perhaps more significant than the node it is going to, right? Sort of like when you're in line for that new iPhone. In a lot of ways, one could make a very strong argument that one is pursuing the ideological concept of the product more so than the physical product itself. Right? They're hyping themselves up because that marketing that Apple, you know, I'm just using Apple as an example, the marketing that Apple provided in order to get that person in line was so effective and effectuated them so much in an emotional sense that it used minds to affect hearts and hearts to affect minds. And in some cases, you have people that are more excited for the anticipation of the product than when they actually get it. You see what I mean? And then sometimes they got to convince themselves, oh yeah, it was worth that wait in line. And I'm not trying to say that it's the people shouldn't be waiting in line for things. I'm just saying that it speaks to this idea psychologically of one is pursuing something, and that pursuit, the journey of that pursuit may be, I'm not saying it is, but maybe more substantial than once that goal is attained. Because once that pursuit and objective is attained, it's kind of like, okay, what's next? Right? So
yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I think generally, you know, people who aren't curious about this sort of thing, if they looked, you know, deep within themselves, they couldn't honestly say that, you know, they've nailed it in terms of answering all the philosophical questions in their lives. I mean, you mentioned to an extent the philosophical arguments about the nature of reality earlier. You know, it goes back, you know, centuries. You know, people like Plato and Descartes. I mean, there's elements of it, of simulation theory in like Buddhist reincarnation. But lately it's taken on a more technological element.
Yeah.
Certainly with films and shows like the Matrix, the new Avatar film. Have you seen that new Netflix series, 1899?
No, but I have been watching a series called Peripheral, I believe. And that's also pretty, in my humble opinion, that's pretty telling as well. This idea that people think that they're in some type of metaverse when in reality they aren't, but they think they are. In some cases, they are in a metaverse. Other cases, they're actually in quote unquote real life or this reality, but while being tricked. I would say that perhaps a lot of this is being disseminated via the entertainment industry for far more than just entertainment. But that's just me.
Yeah, I tend to believe that as well. Don't worry. Yeah. Something that's stuck with me, I can't remember where and when I heard it, but it was a mathematical theory that once we've created the ability to simulate reality once, we're able to simulate it an infinite amount of times, which makes the odds of this being reality infinity to one. That's obviously concerning. Have governments been investigating the idea that this could be a simulation, or indeed attempting to create it themselves? And I don't just mean like Zuckerberg's metaverse. I mean like
no, I hear you. That's a great question. Where actually that's where a lot of my work at SALT falls into place. And so what I'm gonna have to unfortunately respectfully draw a red line there. But what I can say is that they're far beyond that. That's they're far beyond that.
Don't do that.
It gets interesting, because then this is where, how does one divulge this to the masses without making people go absolutely nuts and say, what do you mean that those savings I've been working on in the bank account, what does that even mean at this point, and things like that. But I think the conversation is going to have to be had soon. In at least within the next 3 to 5 years, in my opinion. Hence why you see a lot of people see behind the scenes, not just with the UAP stuff, but with even in general politics and global affairs, you name it. There seems to be conflicting ideologies behind the scenes, whether it has to do with freedom of speech, or whether it has to do with, should there even be any type of military presence of certain nations in other parts of the planet. It's not for me to say, but it seems to be that these questions seem to be far more prevalent, more and more center stage, if that makes sense. So that's where I'd go with that.
Yeah. Once you start thinking about these things, do you find it difficult to participate in everyday life? Do you know what I mean? Like, you're just cutting about, and in the back of your mind, you're like, well, this could be a simulation. What the hell's the point of any of it?
Well, I'll tell you, man, honestly, I take a glass half full perspective, where I say, okay, if it is one, let me try and figure out how I can get out of it, or, have joy in the journey type situation, right? Whether we're in some type of trap or not, or whether it's part of our experience as a sovereign soul or something like this, the joy is in the journey. So either way, what are you going to do? Stop living? That's how I see it personally. And I don't mean that towards you. I just say in general. With that said, it does take, in my humble opinion, a bit of a strong-willed mind to be able to sort of perhaps have a switch, to be able to turn it off after a certain point of the day and just say, you know what, I'm going to throw on a movie and that's it. Because if not, one is going to go crazy. Even the best of the best, the sharpest of the sharpest in the best universities, they have to shut off at some point. Whether it's, go play poker with friends, or go play pool, or go watch a movie, or, something like this, go for a walk in the park, go play video games or something of the sort. It speaks to this idea as well, and including myself, that to a large degree, not in a bad way, everyone is a hypocrite, so to speak. But the question is, are we conscious of it or not? Right? Are we conscious of the hypocrisy in which a lot of people seem to postulate and what have you? So, and I don't mean that necessarily politically. I even say that scientifically as well. But that's part of the, that's why a lot of these individuals, the academics in which I'm working with, even as we speak, they take every month or two, they take a week or two off, and they go to a forest, they go hiking, or they do something to really switch off, because if not, you're just going to burn yourself out and go absolutely nuts, unfortunately.
Yeah, I felt a little bit like that in the summer. Like I said, with when you're constantly reading stuff about the World Economic Forum and everything, you just sooner or later you just want to sack it off and just never hear about it again. But it's a bit in your face sometimes.
Yep.
I heard you speaking about accessing the dark web. For those of us too scared to go on it, how much material on there could you describe as life-changing?
Quite a substantial amount. Unfortunately, there seems to have been a wipe recently on it, as there was, I think, a year or two back as well. That doesn't mean that it's not valuable. It just shows me that as well, that there are certain elements or forces of various world governments and or otherwise that are catching on more and more to how some of these methods are done. But there's a lot of it's a double-edged sword, brother, in the sense of, it literally goes back, in my humble opinion, based on my personal experience, which is only what I can speak on, and experiments even in certain laboratories. Does one want to know that they're, for example, in a simulation, or does one want to consider it and then not see any potential legitimacy or ascertain the veracity of it or get any proof of it otherwise? Now, could one find proof of it on the dark web? I don't want to say proof, but very strong evidence. Yes, amongst many other things as well, which in fact would unify a lot of the other aspects and depraved elements of life that we have now come to learn about. I'm not trying to connect it all back to the UAP issue, but more so having to do with the general understanding of the reality we're in. So in a short answer, yeah, there's stuff on there that, again, if one is not careful, there goes personal information, there goes where they live, you name it. I don't recommend anyone to do it, but I would be a hypocrite if I said, that I haven't done it myself either. So I haven't been on it as much lately, to be honest with you, because of what I'm doing with Salt and all of that. And I don't, it's not necessarily needed given a lot of the work that I'm doing now. It's more so studying the answers I look for are more so in the academic literature more than anything else these days. But as I was pursuing this in the last, 2-3 years leading up to what occurred about a year ago, as of the time we're recording this, yeah. There were definitely some things that did assist in my pursuit of this, yeah. And I did, yes, I did take some risks in attaining some of that information. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, but I'm still here, so knock on wood.
Good. One of the things that bothers me about it is, I mean, if it was a simulation, why would they whoever is running said simulation leave evidence of the fact it's a simulation within the simulation? If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I would dare to say, and you could, by the way, you can call horseshit on what I'm about to say, no problem. But even the ones that created it have rules to abide by, archetypally, if that makes sense, in a sort of blueprint element. Even because it speaks to this idea of fractality. So even, for example, if we're going to build a house for a birdhouse, right, in the backyard or something like this, we can't just think of it and then the birdhouse appears. We need to get some nails. We got to get a hammer. We got to get some. Now, yes, we can manipulate the shape geometrically, and we can adjust to how we would like the birdhouse to be, but we still have to use certain materials nonetheless. I would say scale that up. It's the same idea.
But isn't that based on our understanding of just everything? I mean, like, what out with the simulation, we can't even comprehend what it might even be. It doesn't necessarily have to be liquid, solid, gas, spiritual, etc. It could look like anything. So what you've said there is based on rules that we've learned about within the simulation, if that makes sense. Not that I'm calling horseshit on what you're saying.
No,
I'm just trying to conceptually understand what could be outside here.
You're absolutely. This goes right back to the joys in the journey. I'm not going to sit here and say that I know the answer to that. What I do know is there have been very strong, conclusive, and experimental and far past experimental understanding of what we're in. But outside of that, I'm not claiming anything at all, brother. Yeah, it's to your point. Yep. I'm speaking specifically from within this reality.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like studying a fish tank from within the fish tank, but you have no idea what's outside. Yeah, no, that makes sense.
And then if it actually, and not to trip anybody out, but say, for example, someone is somehow brought outside the fish tank to observe it externally. Well, are you just in a larger fish tank then? That you then got to go outside of that one? And then that speaks to the idea of, again, joys in the journey. You see what I mean? Constantly learning. It is, quote unquote, magical until it becomes scientifically substantiated, excuse me. And then from there, okay, now it used to be magic, now it's science, but then now there are things within and elements within that science that is still unexplained. Therefore, we can argue it is, quote unquote, magical or unexplainable until that is explained. And then let's inquire even more, and then even more, right? So that speaks to the ontological aspect, in my opinion, and philosophical aspect of just exploring constantly. I mean, there have been people that have claimed, for example, that even non-human entities have said to them, whether it's, gray aliens, people claim, or otherwise, we may know more than your species, but we don't know everything. That's the purpose. So,
yeah, to slightly transition onto aliens, you also mentioned depraved elements of humanity and or society. Originally, looking back through messages, I actually messaged you about a year ago for something particularly dark, and it was a rumor of something known as Uncle Sam's Snuff Factory. If you recall that, you might have it.
Let me see here very quickly. Uncle Sam's. Let's see here.
The gist of it was a base in Texas where people, children in particular, supposedly are harvested for their bloods and energies to hand over to alien entities.
Right. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Do you think there's anything in the notion of energy harvesting for entities out with this reality, if that makes sense? Like, probably the best way of putting it to people would be like the Matrix, like we're all batteries for something else, perhaps.
Unfortunately, yes. There is strong scientific evidence, not just anecdotal, not just circumstantial. And I don't mean to be glass half empty, because for every negative element in that regard, there is also a positive one too. But yeah, yes. Unfortunately, I can't go into detail because it's part of actually what I'm doing with SALT as well. But yes, yeah, and it's not. Yeah.
Do you think that explains the nature of politics and international relations, and to the extent that we seem to be set up to inflict misery upon other humans, which is then that energy is then used elsewhere?
It might be. That's a very strong observation. It might be.
That's concerning, isn't it?
I don't want to be doom and gloom, but yeah, you're in my humble opinion, and it's not for me to say who's right or wrong, but you're definitely asking in this context, in my opinion, the right questions. So I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Yeah. I'd say that we look, for example, at one of Jacques Vallée's books, and forgive me, in about 2-3 minutes, I'm going to have to get going. But we see in Mr. Jacques Vallée's books, this is an older one. I forgot the name of it, but essentially, and I am paraphrasing Mr. Vallée's words here, but when Mr. Vallée said humanity, in his opinion, is being manipulated by a force that... forgive me if I'm trying to remember the quote here. Humanity is being manipulated by an unobservable force in which plays a bizarre game of deception. That along those lines, I'm paraphrasing here, but that's I would agree quite strongly with Mr. Vallée in that regard. I think that people like Mr. Jacques Vallée and others are pretty warm relative to at least the work that I'm doing. I can only speak on behalf of the work I'm doing at SALT and some of the stuff I do, talk about on my show Generation Z podcast. But yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, I mean, I find all this sort of stuff thoroughly fascinating. I'm trying to catch up and go back through all of your stuff slowly but surely and wrap my head around it. I mean, where can people find, if they've enjoyed this, where can they find more of your
Sure. Well, first off, it's been a pleasure, man. I really appreciate it. I would love to have you on my show as well. I think we'd hit it off pretty well, just like we're doing right now. And even if you want to join some roundtables down the road that I plan to be hosting, that you can find me at patreon.com/Generation Z, ZED, as well as Generation Z podcast at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, and of course YouTube. Let's see how long the YouTube thing stays up for. People can also email me at genzpodcast@gmail.com. No space, no capitals. You can also find me on Twitter at PodcastZ. No space, no capitals as well. I do have an email for SALT that I have not yet officially announced, just because of something going on the back end. But if anyone is interested in that, you can just email me at GenZ, and we can go from there with respects to any potential inquiries one may have in that direction. But other than that, I'm super appreciative, and I cannot thank you enough.
Thanks. I mean, I would encourage everyone to seek out Dave's work, particularly the YouTube channel, get onto his Patreon and contribute as well. Obviously, follow all the Political Dark Side social media and whatnot, and that would be a big help. And thanks for joining me today, Dave. All the best.
Thank you, sir. I really appreciate it, man. Truly, and all the best on your end of the your end of the woods there. I've never been to Scotland, but I would love to. I would love to check it out. I hear it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's lovely. You're more than welcome to join me anytime you like.
Thank you so much, man.
Join us next time for the Political Dark Side Podcast.
It's a disaster. Whose idea was that? It's just ridiculous.
Available on iTunes, Google, and Spotify.
For more information, visit politicaldarkside.com.